In a college classroom with a professor teaching philosophy, he says to the class, "Let me explain the problem science has with religion." The atheist professor of philosophy pauses before his class and then asks one of his new students to stand. He says, "You're a Christian, aren't you?" He says, "Yes, sir." "So you believe in God?" The student says, "Absolutely." The professor then asks, "Is God good?" The student says, "Sure, God's good." The professor says, "Is God all-powerful? Can he do anything?" The student says, "Yes." The professor says, "Are you good or evil?" The student replies, "The Bible says I'm evil." The professor then grins knowingly and says, "Ah, the Bible. Here's one for you. Let's say there's a sick person over here and you can cure him. Can you do it? Would you help him? Would you try?" The student says, "Yes, sir, I would." So the professor says, "Well, then you're good." And the student replies, says, "I wouldn't exactly say that." "But why not say that? Would you help a sick person or a maimed person if you could? Most of us would, but God doesn't." The student then does not answer, so the professor continues. "He doesn't, does he? My brother was a Christian and died of cancer, even though he prayed to Jesus to heal him. How is this Jesus good? Can you answer me that one?" And the professor continues and says, "No, you can't, can you? Let's start again, young fella. Is God good?" He says, yes." "Is Satan good?" The student doesn't hesitate to say no. "Then where does Satan come from?" The student replies, "From God." "That's right. God made Satan, didn't he? Tell me, son, is there evil in this world?" He says, "Yes, sir." "Evil's everywhere, isn't it? And God did make everything, correct?" "Yes," he replies. "So who created evil?" the professor continued. "If God created everything, then God created evil. Since evil exists according to the principle of your works, then God is evil." Again, the student has no answer. Is there sickness, immorality, hatred, ugliness? All of these terrible things, do they not exist in the world? So who created them? The student did not answer again. Professor repeats his question, "Who created them?" There is still no answer. The class is mesmerized. He continues on to another student. "Do you believe in Jesus Christ, son?" The student's voice betrays him and cracks. Yes, professor, I do." The old man, pacing, says, "Science says you have 5 senses you use to identify and observe the world around you. Have you ever seen Jesus?" "No, sir, I haven't seen him." "Have you heard Jesus?" "No, sir, I have not." "Have you ever felt Jesus, tasted Jesus, smelt your Jesus? Have you ever had any sensory perception of Jesus Christ, or God for that matter?" "No, sir, I'm afraid I haven't," he replied. "Yet you still believe in him?" And he says, "Yes. According to demonstrable protocol, science says your God does not exist. What do you say about that, son?" He says, "Nothing." The student replies, "I only have my faith." "Yes, faith," the professor repeats. "And that is the problem science has with God. There is no evidence, only faith." The student stands quietly for a moment before asking a question of his own. "Professor, is there such thing as heat?" The professor replies, "Yes." "And is there such thing as cold?" "Yes, son. There's cold too, he replies. No, sir, there isn't, the student says. The student begins to explain. You can have lots of heat, even more heat, superheat, mega heat, unlimited heat, white heat, little heat, or no heat. But we don't have anything called cold. We can hit down to 458 degrees below zero, which is no heat. But we can't go any further after that. There is no such thing as cold. Otherwise, we would be able to go colder than the lowest minus 458 degrees. Every body or object susceptible to study when it has or transmits energy, and heat is what makes our body or matter have or transmit energy. Absolute zero minus 458 Fahrenheit is the total absence of heat. You see, sir, cold is only a word we use to describe the absence of heat. We cannot measure cold. Heat we can measure in thermal units because heat is energy. Cold is not the opposite of heat, sir. Just the absence of it. What about darkness, Professor? Is there such thing as darkness? The professor says, yes, without hesitation. What is night if it isn't darkness? The student says, you're wrong, sir. Darkness is not something. It is the absence of something. You can have low light, normal light, bright light, even flashing light. But if you have no light constantly, you have nothing, and it's called darkness, isn't it? It's the meaning we use to define the word. In reality, darkness isn't. If it were, you would be able to make darkness even darker, wouldn't you? The professor begins to smile at the student and says, this is going to be an interesting semester. So, what is your point that you're making, young man? He says. Yes, Professor, my point is your philosophical premise is flawed too. He says, flawed? Can you explain how? You're working on the premise of duality, the student explains. You argue that there is life and then there's death, and good God and a bad God. You are viewing the concept of God as something finite, something we can measure. Science even can't explain a single thought. It uses electricity and magnetism, but you have never seen much fully understood either one. To view death as the opposite of life is to be ignorant of the fact that death cannot exist as a thing. Death is not opposite of life, just the absence of it. Now tell me, Professor, do you teach your students that they evolved from a monkey? If you are referring to the natural evolutionary process, young man, yes, of course I do, he replies. Have you ever observed evolution with your own eyes, sir? Since no one has ever observed the process of evolution at work and cannot even prove that this process is an ongoing endeavor, are you not teaching your opinion, sir? Are you now not a scientist but a preacher? Is there anyone in the classroom who has ever seen the professor's brain? The class then breaks into laughter. Is there anyone here who has ever heard the professor's brain? Felt the professor's brain? Or touched or smelt professor's brain? No one appears to have done so. So according to established rules of stable demonstrational protocol, science says that you have no brain. So if science says you have no brain, how can we trust your lectures, sir?